Greetings to everyone. My name is Vasco Diogo, and I'm a researcher at the Swiss Federal Research Institute, WSL. Actually, in this presentation, I will show you work that I've previously developed in my previous job at Wageningen Economic Research, together with my former colleagues, in which we have developed a global agricultural land use modeling framework based on economic theory. So just to put this work into perspective, we know that agricultural land systems are facing a complex combination of sustainability challenges. Not only there will be a need to keep increasing food production to feed a growing world population, but we will have to achieve that while coping with increased impacts from climate change, and while at the same time attempting to reduce the environmental impacts of intensive agriculture production, such as degradation of water and soil resources and other environmental systems, ecosystem services, sorry. And this will have to be achieved while competing for land with other land uses, such as increased urbanization, forestry, nature conservation. So there is a need to develop solutions that are able to balance the trade-offs between the provision of food and also the provision of other important land services. However, the ability to do so will depend on the aggregate effects of multiple decisions on the use of land. So there is a need to understand the interplay between different determinants of land use, so we can better support the design of robust strategies that can cope with impending challenges. For that purpose, land use models can help us and be used as learning tools to explore the multi-scale interactions between drivers of land use change, to test hypotheses on the causal links between drivers, processors, and patterns of land use change, and also to reveal which patterns might arise in the future under future alternative scenarios. And as such, provide to us integrated analysis that take into account both local characteristics and the regional and global contexts. Why do we need a global economic modeling framework of agricultural land use? Well, we know that local land use decisions are increasingly influenced by globalized markets, decisions by distant governments, and global agenda setting. As an example, for instance, foreign direct investments have been identified as one of the main causes of cropland expansion and deforestation in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And as such, modeling land use needs to account for the effects of trade and policies that regulate these trade flows across global regions. However, large-scale land use models usually rely on the external future projections of land use demand that, for instance, can be obtained from global economic models, such as computable general equilibrium models. And then they allocate projected demand in space by extrapolating past observed trends of land use patterns, such as, for instance, using statistical methods that can find relationships between observed land use patterns and an assumed set of spatial drivers to then operationalize these relationships through probabilistic suitability maps. In this case, we can see an example on how an analysis of land use patterns using a set of assumed drivers such as crop suitability, distance to cities, and other types of spatial drivers can then be used to come up with a suitability map that is able to reproduce with a high probability the areas where these land use patterns are observed. However, this type of inductive modeling approach does not really account for the effects of non-spatial drivers that can affect local competitive advantages of alternative land use. That means that the coupling with global equilibrium models is to some extent incomplete because economic policy instruments such as subsidies, taxes, payments for economic ecosystem services, or changes in commodity price and production costs, or either the feasibility of adopting alternative technologies or adaptation measures cannot be fully into account because it cannot be translated into a spatial map directly. So for this purpose, my former team at Wageningen Economic Research We developed a multi-model land use modeling framework that attempts to have at the same time global coverage while taking into account regional contexts and local specific features, while capturing explicitly the interplay between spatial and non-spatial drivers operating at different scales. And according to that, specify the causality between drivers, process, and outcomes of agricultural land use change that result from economic decisions on land. So this is a figure graphically depicting the modeling framework. On the top level, we see the part of the framework that deals with global level dynamics. On one hand, we have the definition of scenarios that allow us to establish the relationship between trends on the global economy with its impacts on the global climate, or on the other hand, translate global climate impacts into impacts on the global economy. And based on these storylines, on the left side, then downscale these global climate simulations into regional climate patterns that can be then translated into more local level weather patterns that, together with topographical features and soil characteristics, affect the water availability and potential biophysical suitability for crop production. On the other hand, the economic models can allows us to then downscale trade flows and policy alternatives that have impacts on the trade between regions and affect commodity prices, costs of production factors, productivity, and production volumes at the regional level, which can then be coupled together with crop suitability maps in order to determine the utility of alternative production options. And when we combine this with the projections on the land area required for production to regional level, we can then simulate the allocation of the agricultural land use for the future. So in a nutshell, this multimodal framework combines scenario projections on potential crop yields from global gridded crop growth models with agronomic conditions, for instance, simulated by global CGE models, to then perform the evaluation of local utility of agricultural land use alternatives, to then simulate the allocation of agricultural land use through utility maximization. This framework has been operationalized into MagnetGrid, which is a new land use modeling platform that then simulates future global spatial patterns of agricultural land use, and is able to do that according to alternative climate and socioeconomic scenarios, and as such allocate grant agricultural land use according to projected local economic competitive advantages that can be obtained from different agricultural land use alternatives. We developed this framework through a flexible modular structure that is composed by 3 modules. One on data consolidation that attempts to merge together the data inputs from different sources and models, which then are used to compute spatial cost benefit analysis to come up with sector and regional specific utility maps to then perform land use modeling according to an allocation algorithm based on utility maximization. This modular structure allows to not only incorporate economic projections from different CGEs, then for instance, the MagnetGrid model, which has been developed by Wageningen Economic Research, but the way the model is structured is such that we can incorporate projections from other CGEs, and as such include also different scenario dependent configurations, for instance, on regional aggregation, for instance, how countries are aggregated into simulated regions, and sector aggregation, how different commodities are aggregated into simulated agricultural sectors. We can also incorporate alternative spatial data sources, which means that we are able to incorporate crop yield map projections that are obtained with different gridded crop growth models, and also even incorporate alternative definitions of land utility. So how does the model work in practice? We start with the data consolidation module, which we have global yield projection maps and current land use maps that are provided at the individual crop level. However, CGE models usually simulate aggregated regions and agricultural sectors. This means that we need to first specify the relational mapping from countries to simulated regions and from crops to simulated agricultural sectors, so that we can merge together the data from the different sources. And so that is done in such a way that the specifications from the CG model are respected, so that in the end we have a unified set for each region with projections per sector on production value, production volume, land demand, labor costs, capital costs, intermediate input costs, land costs, and net subsidies and taxes. And that we have for each sector a sector-specific suitability map and a sector-specific land use map. These data inputs are then used within the spatial cost-benefit analysis module, in which we calculate the utility of each agricultural land use type. And for the specification of utility, in this case, we take into account both drivers of land use change by computing the net present value for in each time step for each land use type, which means that is the expected value that an investment will have discounted over time, so in order to capture the attractivity of changing land use to that particular land use type. And on the other hand, we have drivers of land use inertia, in this case specified as opportunity costs of converting an existing land use, and also the sunk costs that were incurred to have that land use in place in that specific grid cell. So we do this by combining the sector projections from the CGE with then the sector-specific land use maps, and we need to know also what is the land use in that particular starting point to know what are the opportunities and costs involved in converting land. And with that, we come up with one map for each combination of magnet region, sector, and simulated year that represents in a spatially explicit way the land utility per sector, translated in terms of, for instance, dollars per hectare. We then use these utility maps within the land use modeling module, in which we use a allocation algorithm based on discrete choice among mutually exclusive land use alternatives. This algorithm attempts to explain the probability of a certain land use being chosen in a particular location according to the utility of that specific land use in relation to the total utility of all possible alternatives. This is then implemented through a doubly constrained logic model that in practice means that we use two balancing factors for each endogenous land use type and grid cell specifically that are adjusted iteratively so that the constraints below are satisfied. I mean, particularly that the total land use area by region and sector as projected by the CGE is allocated, and that we take into account that in each cell there is land unavailable for agriculture, for instance, because of existing urban areas or protected areas. So in the land use modeling framework, the combination of land use projections and the different land utility maps for each sector, we optimize land use through the land optimization algorithm that allows us to derive projections of land use maps to the future that then are updated for the next time step in order to compute the utility map for the next time step while taking into account dynamically of the land use that has been allocated in the previous time step. We have then performed a validation exercise between the years 2000 and 2010, in which we attempt to assess to what extent we are able to reproduce land use change patterns between these 2 years. We use agroeconomic sectoral projections from the magnet CGE model with 27 regions and 9 sectors. We used as a way to specify crop suitability the IAZA Global Agroecological Zone database, while also distinguishing ring-fed and irrigated agricultural lands through the FAO Global Mapping Irrigation Areas irrigation maps. As a starting point for the simulation, we used global crop land use area maps from MapSpam, and we simulated land use with a 10 by 10 kilometer spatial resolution, in which we simulated the percentage of agricultural land per grid cell that is located in each grid cell. When we look into the validation results, we see that we obtained 33% of overall degree of correspondence between observed and simulated patterns in 2010. Magnet grid outperforms the null model in several regions, but not everywhere. So about in two-thirds of the regions, the model actually does better than assuming that no land use change is observed, but in one-third of the regions that is actually not the case, meaning that assuming no change would actually perform better than performing the simulation. In particular, some regions perform relatively well with a degree of correspondence higher than 80%, including important agricultural regions such as India, EU12, Southeast Asia, South America, and Ukraine. However, others perform particularly poorly, such as Central Asia, Middle East, Canada, and Oceania. We have also observed that 87% of observed land use percentage is actually well predicted. But when we look into predicting land use change, then we see that the model still does not perform so well. Only 31% of the observed land use change was actually well predicted, and only 23% of the total land use change that has been simulated was well predicted. We concluded also that the model tends to overestimate land use change by 50%, which means that we might be over optimizing land use, and also perhaps due to input data errors, such as areas that are given biophysical suitability by the gridded crop growth maps that are below what is actually achievable. So it means that land is then reallocated to somewhere else. And also perhaps due to the possible heterogeneity within simulated regions that is not fully well accounted while simulating for such large regions. To conclude, we can conclude that this new modeling framework allows us to explore potential developments in agricultural land systems that are an outcome of economic decisions, and it can be applied both at the global level and for dedicated case studies at the regional country level due to its flexible modular structure. It also allows us to insert a wider range of discontinuities and policy alternatives than conventional land use models based on statistical analysis, since it allows us to incorporate known spatial drivers explicitly, and as such, have a wider range of policy scenarios, and also including societal demands such as dietary preferences, the emergences of new land use options such as second generation biofuel crops, and also the influence of economic factors such as market prices, production costs, subsidies, and taxes. However, the current approach is a bit too deterministic, since it does not take into account social, cultural, and local institutional factors that may contribute to observed land use inertia. Furthermore, current assumptions on economic rationale and perfect foresight are also a bit too simplistic, and thus perhaps fail to capture motivations and preferences other than profit maximization. But still, the model can be able to capture wider global land use change trends and identify potential land use change hotspots that result from the combined effect of broader megatrends. As a way forward, it will be important to incorporate a bit more variability in the local decision-making profiles. For instance, our colleagues at Free University in Amsterdam have identified through synthesis of case studies different types of profiles that have different preferences and are also influenced differently by different drivers. This could perhaps also be then linked together with regional and national farm census and household service to try to identify where these different profiles are located, and accordingly try to specify and validate local utility functions that can represent these profiles better, so that we can have a better specification of the behavior of farmers while making land use decisions on land. Also, it will be important to integrate model framework with other land use sectors, for instance, urban, forestry, and also transportation, and overall to improve the internal coherence between coupled models. It's often that these different models don't always use the same base data, so that needs to be ensured. Also that storylines and assumptions are well aligned and consistent across models. And finally, that feedback mechanisms are incorporated into the way that we couple these models, so that we can better account for internal dynamics on how factors might play a role within the modeling framework of each individual module. So that's all from my side. Thanks a lot for your attention. And if you are interested to learn a bit more about the magnet grid module, you can follow the link to the report here that I provide here in the last slide. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Floor is open for questions. So please.
I have a question, Vasco. First, I wrote congratulations in the chat, because it's really, what you did is phenomenal and difficult. Yeah, I understand that there are limitations too, but there's also a lot of potential. And so my question is, I don't know much about the magnet model at all, but do you think that it can handle, so I don't know what the thematic resolution is. I don't know if you're able to handle, let's say, more refined land use cover classes. And so what I wrote in the chat, because what I'm getting at is, do you think that it's possible to apply the same logic that you have at global scale at a coarse spatial resolution for high resolution applications using magnet?
I guess it's a bit of trade-off between what you're trying to capture within the scenario and how you incorporate that in the model. So magnets, as far as I know, it's very flexible in the way crops and sectors are aggregated. And as such, there will be the ability to have a more refined classification. The trade-off is that will, of course, increase immensely computation time, and that you would need then to simplify, for instance, the number of regions that you're simulating. So if you wanted to have a more refined land use classification in a particular region, that will be possible, but possibly that will come at the cost that you'll have less detail on the other regions that you're simulating. So perhaps you'll have to reduce, just to have like perhaps 4 or 5 larger regions and based on continents, and that of course would then lead to averaging out all the other economic factors and the trade flows between them. So that it's in a nutshell, it is possible but that has still important trade-offs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so maybe I have a question. In this great and wide modeling framework, which is very impressive, so do you allocate irrigated cropland separately from rain-fed cropland, or is it just cropland?
Yeah, so in terms of allocation, the way we have designed the model so far was that we allocate cropland. Although, because in the validation exercise, we actually have data on irrigated land, then we distinguished whether there is irrigation or not in terms of crop suitability. So for simulating future land use, we didn't really think about a mechanism on how to distinguish these, but should be the case that we actually have projections on irrigated land. I don't see why we could not distinguish between irrigated and non-irrigated crops.
Okay.
Although that will mean that we'll also have to have somehow an estimation on the costs associated with irrigation. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Other questions, other remarks? Yeah, okay. Maybe another question from my side. You said that you are also looking at climate change impacts on crop yields. So maybe I missed it, but what type of crop yield model are you applying at the moment?
So in the validation exercise, we used existing crop suitability maps from the IASA database on the baseline conditions. But although I'm not currently involved in that directly, what I know is that the linkage between magnets and LPGML crop growth model is being now attempted, because the two models are part of the Wageningen consortium. So that's the linkage that is now being attempted.
Okay.
But in principle, any model that is able to provide global or even regional gridded yield projections can be incorporated.
Because my thought was just when you are looking at costs, basically you also, it would also be interesting to take into account crop management somehow, inputs of fertilizer and whatever. And there it would also be interesting, of course, to integrate also these aspects into the crop modeling exercise and somehow. But that's it gets
absolutely. That's some of the things that it's video on the wish list.
Yeah.
And to also improve the incorporation of feedback mechanisms and better alignment of all the assumptions between the models, because at the moment the models are working a bit independently and there is really no communication between these factors, but I think there is a huge potential to improve these linkages. Yeah.
So we need a lot of money from the European Union to continue there. Okay, no. Thank you very much. A very, very good presentation and very interesting work. So if there aren't any other questions or remarks at this point, I like to thank you very much for attending the session. I think we really had some very interesting, very good, and also very timely remarks, showing really very timely research done in this realm of land use modeling. All right, and with these, if you have some additional remarks, Jennifer, I would hand over to you.
I second your comments. I really enjoyed all the presentations, and thanks a lot to all the presenters and also to the audience in general. I really enjoyed this session. Thank you.